Sleeping Beauty. Once upon a time there was a king and a queen who were very sorry that they had no children, so sorry that it cannot be told. At last, however, the queen had a daughter. On her first birthday there was a very fine party, and the princess had for her godmothers all the fairies they could find in the whole kingdom. There were 7 of them, so that every single fairy might confer a gift upon her, as was the custom of fairies in those days. By this means the king and queen meant for the princess to have all the perfections imaginable. After the one candle on the great birthday cake was blown out, and the cake was served and eaten out in the garden, the company returned to the king's palace, where was prepared a great feast for all the fairies. At the table servants placed before every one of them a magnificent golden plate covered with a round lid of massive gold, and inside were a spoon and a knife and fork, all of pure gold set with sparkling diamonds and red rubies. But as they were all sitting down at table, they saw a very old fairy come into the hall. She had not been invited, because for more than 50 years she had not left a certain tower, and everyone believed her to be either dead or enchanted. The king ordered her a cover, but he could not give her a magnificent setting of gold as the others had received, because only 7 had been made for the 7 fairies. The old fairy believed she was slighted and insulted, and she muttered threats between her teeth. One of the young fairies who sat nearby heard her, and, expecting that the old fairy might give the little princess some unlucky gift, hid herself behind the curtains as soon as they left the table. The young fairy hoped that she might speak last, and so might be able to undo as much as she could the evil which the old fairy might do. In the meanwhile, all the other fairies began to give their gifts to the princess. One gave her for her gift that she should be the most beautiful person in the world. The next, that she should have the wit and wisdom of a scholar. The third, that she should have a heart as virtuous and good as an angel. The fourth, that she should dance gracefully. The fifth, that she should sing like a nightingale bird. And the sixth, that she should play all kinds of musical instruments perfectly well. The old fairy's turn coming next, her head shaking more with spite and cruelty than with age, she said that the princess would stick her fingertip with a needle-sharp spindle, a stick women used to spin wool hairs into thread. And she said that from the wound to her fingertip the princess would die. This terrible gift made the whole company tremble with fear, and everybody fell to crying. At this very instant the young fairy came from behind the curtains and said these words in a loud voice: "You may be sure, O king and queen, that your daughter shall not die of this disaster. It is true I have no power to undo entirely what the elder fairy has done. The princess shall indeed stick her fingertip with a needle-sharp spindle stick, but, instead of dying, she shall only fall into a deep sleep, which shall last 100 years, at the end of which a king's son shall come and awake her." The king, hoping to avoid the misfortune foretold by the old fairy, issued orders forbidding anyone, on pain of death, to spin wool into thread with a distaff and spindle, or even to have a spindle in the house. About 15 or 16 years afterwards, when the king and queen had traveled to visit one of their country castles, the young princess was one day running up and down the palace stairways. She went from room to room, and at last she came into a little attic garret room on the top of the tower, where a good old woman alone was spinning with her spindle. This good woman had never heard of the king's orders against spindles. "What are you doing there, my good woman?" said the princess. "I am spinning, my pretty child," said the old woman, who did not know who the princess was. "Oh," said the princess, "this looks very interesting. Please let me see if I can do it." She had no sooner taken the spindle into her hand than, either because she was too quick and careless, or because the fairy had so ordered it, the spindle's needle-sharp point punctured the tip of her finger, and she fell down in a faint. The good old woman, not knowing what to do, cried out for help. People came in from every chamber of the palace. They threw water upon the girl's face, unlaced her bodice, slapped her on the palms of her hands, and rubbed her forehead with perfume, but nothing would bring her to herself or wake her. Then the king, who had just returned, came up at hearing all the noise, and remembered what the fairies had foretold. He knew very well that this must come to pass and happen, since the fairies had foretold it, and he ordered that the princess be carried into the finest room in his palace, and be laid upon an elegant bed all embroidered with gold and silver. A person would have taken her for a little angel, she was so beautiful, for her swooning faint had not dimmed the brightness of her complexion. Her cheeks were rosy, and her lips coral red. It is true her eyes were shut, but people heard her breathe very softly, which convinced those about her that she was not dead. The king gave orders that they should let her sleep quietly till the time came for her to awake. The good fairy, who had saved her life by foretelling that the princess would sleep for 100 years, was far away in the kingdom of Matakin, 12,000 leagues away, when this accident befell the princess. But the good fairy was instantly told about it by a little dwarf who informed her, a dwarf who had 7-league boots and could stride over 7 leagues of ground at one step. The fairy started off at once, and arrived, about an hour later, in a fiery chariot drawn by dragons. The king helped her out of the chariot, and she approved everything he had done. But she told him that when the princess awakened after 100 years' sleep, she might be worried and not know what to do if she found herself all alone in this old palace. To keep the princess from being afraid, the good fairy touched with her wand everything in the palace, except the king and queen. She enchanted the governesses and babysitters, maids of honor, the ladies and gentlemen, officers, stewards, cooks, laundresses, tailors, undercooks, kitchen maids, chimney sweeps, guards, and footmen. She likewise touched all the chickens and peacocks and geese in the yard, the cows in the barns, the carriage horses and the saddle horses, the grooms who cared for them, the great dogs in the dog kennels, and little Mopsy, too, the princess's pet spaniel dog, which was lying on the bed. As soon as she touched them, they all fell asleep, not to awake again until their mistress did, so that they would be ready to serve her when she wanted them. The very grills in the fireplace, cooking turkeys and pheasants, fell asleep, and the fire itself as well. All this was done in a moment. Fairies are not long in doing their work. And now the king and queen, having kissed their dear child without waking her, went out of the palace and sent forth orders that nobody should come near it. These orders were not necessary, for in a quarter of an hour's time there grew up all round about the palace grounds such a vast number of trees, great and small, bushes and bramble thorns, twisting inside and outside each other, so that neither man nor beast could pass through, so that nothing could be seen but the very tip-top of the palace towers, and even these only from afar off. Everyone knew that this also was the work of the fairy, so that while the princess slept she would have nothing to fear from curious people. After 100 years, the son of a king from a neighboring kingdom was hunting nearby, and he asked what those towers were which he saw in the middle of a great thick wood. Everyone told him what they had heard. Some said that it was an old haunted castle, others that all the witches of the country met there at midnight. But most people said it was a wicked ogre's den, and that he alone had the power to make his way through the wood. The prince did not know what to believe, and presently a very aged old woodcutter spake to him thus, saying, "Your Highness, more than 50 years ago I heard from my father that this castle protects the most beautiful princess that was ever seen, that she must sleep there 100 years, and that she can be awakened only by a king's son, for whom she is waiting." Hearing this, the young prince was all on fire. He thought that he could end this rare adventure, and pushed on by love and the desire of glory, resolved at once to find the princess. As soon as he began to get near to the wood, all the great trees, the bushes, and bramble thorns moved apart by themselves to let him pass through. He walked up to the castle, which he saw at the end of a wide avenue, and you can imagine he was quite surprised when he saw none of his people following him, because as soon as he had passed through the trees and bushes, they had closed tight behind him. However, nothing would stop him. A young prince in search of glory is always valiant and brave. He came into a wide open outer court, and what he saw was enough to freeze him with horror. A frightful silence covered everything. The image of death was everywhere, and there was nothing to be seen but what seemed to be the outstretched bodies of dead men and animals. He, however, very well knew, by the ruby faces and pimpled noses of the servants, that they were only asleep, and their goblets, which still contained some drops of wine, showed plainly that they had fallen asleep while drinking their wine. He then crossed a court paved with marble stones, went up the stairs, and came into the guard chamber, where guards were standing in their ranks, with their musket guns upon their shoulders, and snoring with all their might. He went through several rooms full of gentlemen and ladies, some standing and others sitting, but all were asleep. He came into a golden chamber, where he saw upon a bed, the curtains of which were all open, the most beautiful sight he had ever beheld. A princess who appeared to be about 15 or 16 years of age, and whose bright and resplendent beauty had something divine in it. He approached with trembling and admiration, and fell down upon his knees before her. Then, as the end of the enchantment came, the princess awoke, and looking on him with eyes more tender than could have been expected at first sight, said, "Is it you, my prince? You have waited a long while." The prince, charmed with these words, and much more with the way in which they were spoken, knew not how to show his joy and gratitude. He assured her that he loved her more than he loved himself. Their conversation did not make much sense, but they were pleased, for where there is much love, there is little logic. He was more confused than she, and we need not be surprised, for she had had time to think of what to say to him, as during her long sleep the good fairy had given the princess very pleasant dreams. In short, they talked together for many hours, and then they said not half of what they wanted to say. In the meanwhile, all the palace had awakened with the princess. Every person thought about his own business, and as the servants were not in love, they felt ready to die of hunger. The lady of honor, being as hungry as the other folks, grew very impatient, and loudly told the princess that the meal was served. The prince helped the princess to stand. She was magnificently dressed, though the prince was careful not to tell her that with her high collar and long sleeves she was dressed in clothes as old-fashioned as his great-grandmother's. She looked not a bit the less charming and beautiful for all that. They went into the great mirrored hall, where they ate their supper and were served by the officers of the princess's household. The violins and flutes played songs with old tunes, but they sounded excellent, though they had not been played for 100 years. Immediately after supper, without losing any time, the Prime Minister married them in the palace chapel, and forever afterward they lived in great happiness and joy.
This has been an Augusta State University audio text.
All rights reserved. Copyright 2009.
Thanks for listening.